The war had ended, but its echoes lingered in every corner of Japan's shattered hospitals. Smoke still clung to the air, and the cries of the wounded blended with the wind outside. Aiko Nakamura, a 22-year-old nurse, moved between cots with quiet precision. Every step felt like walking through the memory of a nightmare that refused to fade. Her uniform was worn thin, its red cross patch barely holding to the sleeve. She carried a basin of water that rippled with every heartbeat, her own reflection trembling across it. Around her lay both Japanese civilians and captured Allied soldiers, the boundaries between enemy and friend blurring with every groan. The smell of iodine and burned wood filled the room, heavy and human. Outside, rain beat against the broken windows, washing ash into the mud. The war was over, but peace had not yet learned how to speak. Aiko paused beside a stretcher, where a wounded American sergeant lay unconscious, his uniform torn, but his face calm. For a long moment, she simply watched his chest rise and fall, surprised to feel relief. She had been taught that Americans were monsters. In training, she'd been told they would mock her, hurt her, strip her of honor. Yet here she was, adjusting the blanket of one without fear. The human truth felt heavier than any propaganda. When the generator failed, plunging the ward into dim candlelight, Aiko stayed. Her colleagues fled toward the officers' barracks, but she kept her post, whispering small prayers over fevered men. The sound of rain softened, replaced by the rhythm of breathing. She realized that survival itself had its own kind of holiness. Hours passed like years. Aiko's hands shook from exhaustion as she cleaned wounds and changed dressings by feel alone. The American stirred once, muttering something she didn't understand, but his tone was gentle. She answered with silence, the only language left when words had lost their meaning. Dawn crept through the shattered windows, a gray light revealing her still on duty. Mud stained her knees, her hair clung to her face, and yet there was peace in her eyes. When the doctor entered, he froze at the sight, enemy and healer sharing the same air without hatred. The line between them had dissolved like smoke. The American's fever broke that morning. When his eyes opened, they met hers and neither looked away. He managed a single word, thanks. Barely audible, but filled with something she recognized instantly, sincerity. It was the first English word she ever truly understood. She bowed slightly and replied, "You live," her accent thick but her meaning clear. For the first time since the surrender, the ward was quiet enough for peace to breathe. The sergeant smiled faintly, a smile that cost him pain, but gave her courage. She returned it, surprised at her own heart's response. By the time other soldiers entered, the storm outside had passed. They found the nurse still tending the wounded American, her movements careful, unflinching. No one spoke. Even battle-hardened men felt the weight of what they were seeing. Compassion had just stepped across the last frontier of war. The commander later recorded the scene in his journal. One Japanese nurse remained all night with our men. She saved 3 lives. The note would vanish into archives, forgotten by history. But for those present, it became scripture. Humanity, it turned out, had survived the war after all. When Aiko finally stepped outside, the morning air was clean, almost kind. She closed her eyes and let the first sunlight in months touch her face. Somewhere behind her, an American soldier whispered, "God bless her." It was a benediction she didn't hear, but somehow felt. The war had taken her family, her city, and her faith. But in the quiet of that dawn, she had discovered something that could never be taken: mercy. And though she didn't yet know it, this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything. Because soon, the world would witness an act of gratitude, so pure, it would make even soldiers weep. 2 days passed before the American soldiers were strong enough to move again. Their wounds had been cleaned, their fevers broken, their fear slowly replaced by a quiet respect for the nurse who had never left their side. Aiko worked as though sleep were unnecessary, her hands moving with the calm of someone who had already made peace with pain. To the men watching, she seemed more angel than enemy. When word spread through the ward that she had saved 3 of their own, the soldiers wanted to thank her. But gratitude was difficult in a place where words carried the scars of war. Instead, they began leaving small tokens at her station. Ribbons, patches, and a bar of chocolate carefully unwrapped to show it was safe. She didn't take them, but she smiled for the first time. That smile rippled through the ward like sunlight. Hardened men who had lost everything found themselves sitting a little straighter, reminded that gentleness could still exist in ruins. Aiko, confused by their kindness, bowed each time they passed her, her movements slow and deliberate, as though bowing to something larger than men, perhaps hope itself. On the morning of his discharge, the American sergeant who had nearly died asked for her by name. He was still pale, his arm bound in white cloth, but his eyes were alive. When Aiko stepped into the room, she froze. He had stood up to greet her. She looked around for permission, but the other medics only nodded quietly. He spoke slowly, each word trembling. "You saved me," he said. "Not just my arm." Miyako bowed deeply, unsure how to respond, but then he did something no one in that room would ever forget. He stepped forward and wrapped her in a brief, trembling embrace. It wasn't the hug of lovers or friends. It was the hug of a man who had finally found forgiveness in another soul. For a moment, the entire ward went silent. The sound of distant rain faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of 2 hearts that had survived opposite sides of the same war. Even the air felt sacred. When he pulled away, Aiko's eyes were wide with disbelief. No one had ever touched her with such gentleness. In her culture, such gestures were rare, reserved for family or dying comrades. But this man, this foreign soldier, had given her the first touch that carried no demand, no authority, only thanks. The sergeant bowed his head slightly, his voice low and steady. "For all the pain we caused, I'm sorry." Then, almost reverently, he pressed his forehead lightly to hers, not a kiss, but something quieter, a prayer without words. Around them, even the injured bowed their heads. In that moment, the war ended for everyone who witnessed it. Enemies became humans. Hatred became memory. The nurse stood trembling, not out of fear, but out of the realization that compassion could be stronger than any flag. She reached up and adjusted his bandage, her fingers careful, almost ceremonial. "You live," she whispered again, her English broken, but clear. He smiled, understanding every word that language couldn't say. The nurses watching began to cry softly. A photojournalist near the door quietly raised his camera and took a single picture. It captured the moment perfectly. Mud-stained floor, torn uniforms, 2 souls meeting between ruin and redemption. That image would later circle the world under the caption, "The End of War." To the men who saw it, it wasn't about victory or defeat anymore. It was about what remained when everything else had been stripped away. Human decency. Aiko returned to her rounds in silence, but her heart beat differently now, heavier, fuller. Something had shifted forever. The soldiers would talk about that moment for years, how a nurse in a ruined hospital reminded them that mercy wasn't weakness. It was strength. None of them knew her name, but they all remembered her face. And long after the headlines faded, one truth stayed. War had ended on paper weeks ago, but peace began here, in a single act of courage to care. The photograph developed 3 days later in a dim Allied press room. Grainy, imperfect, it showed an American soldier, bandaged and weary, embracing a Japanese nurse amid a sea of broken beds. The editors didn't know what to make of it. Was it mercy, guilt, or redemption caught in a single frame? When the picture reached Tokyo newspapers, it caused confusion first, then silence. Citizens stared at the image of a woman who looked like their daughters, touching a man who had once been their enemy, and felt something unfamiliar, relief. The war had dehumanized everyone. Now suddenly, there was a face, a gesture, a bridge. American readers saw it next, printed under the headline, "Peace in a Single Embrace." Veterans stopped mid-breath when they saw it. Some wept quietly, not from sorrow, but from the strange recognition that they had once fought to destroy the very people who could still show them grace. That contradiction began to heal them. Military officials hesitated at first, worried that the picture blurred the lines between victory and empathy. But the public saw something purer, humanity unmasked. Radio hosts began reading the caption aloud, their voices trembling with emotion. A nurse without a country, a soldier without hate. Across both nations, people began writing letters to newspapers about the nurse in the photo. Mothers said they wanted to teach their children kindness like hers. Veterans' wives said it reminded them that mercy was part of duty, too. Compassion, it seemed, had gone viral before the word existed. Historians later noted that for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese and American citizens shared the same emotion about the same image, pride, not in victory, but in forgiveness. The photograph had captured the moment when the human spirit chose decency over revenge, and the world noticed. In post-war Japan, where ruins still smoked and ration lines stretched for miles, the image became a quiet act of rebellion against despair. Women looked at the nurse's face and saw hope. Men saw the possibility of a nation rebuilt not through dominance, but through compassion. One gesture had redrawn the moral map of war. The Americans, too, began to rethink what victory meant. Was it about destruction, or the courage to rebuild what was broken? Editorials called it the beginning of understanding. Churches displayed the image beside verses about forgiveness, calling it proof that even war could not kill empathy. Aiko herself never saw the newspapers. She continued her work in silence, unaware that her face had become a global symbol. But she felt the change in the way soldiers spoke to her, softer now, grateful. She didn't know she was teaching the world how to heal. Months later, American officers searched for her name, wanting to honor her service. They found her tending to children in a ruined village hospital, still wearing the same faded uniform. When they told her about the photo, she only bowed and said, "Then maybe it did some good." That humility moved them more than the image ever could. The picture traveled farther, to Europe, to Australia, even to classrooms decades later. It became shorthand for reconciliation, proof that peace was not written by politicians, but by ordinary people with tired hands and open hearts. Aiko's quiet compassion had outlived every headline. A monument would later be built near the site of that hospital, not of generals or battles, but of a nurse and a soldier, captured mid-embrace. Tourists came not to mourn, but to reflect. Beneath the statue, the words read simply, "Where humanity met war and won." Years later, that photo would hang in both American and Japanese museums, side by side. Children asked their parents, "Who were they?" And the answer was always the same. Two people who remembered what we forgot. The nurse never sought fame, but history refused to let her fade, because sometimes The greatest victories are not fought with bullets or banners, but with hands that dare to heal across enemy lines. Aiko didn't recognize the world that now knew her name. The war that had stripped her of everything was suddenly calling her a hero, a saint, a bridge between enemies. To her, she was just a tired nurse who had refused to stop caring. Letters began to arrive at the hospital, some from America, some from Japanese families she'd never met. They thanked her for reminding the world that kindness still existed, even in hell. Aiko read them slowly, one by one, until her eyes blurred with tears she didn't know she still had. But peace brought ghosts of its own. Every night she dreamed of the faces she couldn't save, both American and Japanese, calling her name through smoke. The world saw her as a symbol of mercy, but she saw herself as a survivor of mercy's cost. When journalists finally found her, they expected wisdom or poetry. Instead, she told them softly, "I only did what anyone should have done." The reporters looked disappointed, but the soldiers who overheard bowed their heads. Fame unsettled her. She had once worked unseen in blood and ruin. Now strangers called her the nurse of peace. Every word of praise felt heavier than the bullets she had once carried. Still, Aiko could not ignore what her act had inspired. New clinics opened in the wreckage of Tokyo, funded by Allied donations that cited her story. Her compassion had become contagious. Children came to see her at the hospital, clutching newspaper clippings folded like treasures. They wanted to see the woman who had forgiven the enemy. Aiko only smiled and handed them apples, saying, "Healing begins with small things." She tried to fade into the rhythm of normal life, but normal had become impossible. The camera flash that froze her compassion now followed her everywhere. Peace, she realized, could be as relentless as war. On quiet evenings, she returned to the ruined temple near the coast where she once prayed during air raids. She would kneel there, not for Japan or America, but for the nameless dead. The tide washed against her sandals like the breath of the past refusing to die. One night, she met an American officer visiting from a nearby base. He recognized her instantly, his voice breaking as he said, "My brother was in that ward. You saved him." She bowed, but he only placed a folded letter in her hand and whispered, "He never forgot you." When she read the letter later, her hands trembled. The words were simple. "You showed me what winning really means." For the first time in months, Aiko let herself cry without shame. That night, she lit a candle by her window and watched its flame bend in the wind. The world outside was rebuilding, slowly, painfully, but she knew true peace started in smaller places, inside hearts still learning to forgive. The candlelight flickered like an answer to a prayer. Decades later, historians would call her story an emotional ceasefire. They'd say she healed two nations by touching one man's shoulder. Aiko never saw it that way. She always said peace had begun the moment someone chose to stay kind. And though her hands grew frail and her hair turned white, she never stopped tending to others. Her faith wasn't in victory or empire anymore. It was in decency, because she had seen with her own eyes that one small act of care could silence an entire war. 20 years had passed since the photo that changed the world. The hospital where Aiko once worked was gone, replaced by a small clinic surrounded by cherry trees. Each spring, she planted new saplings, believing that growth was the only proper memorial for war. One afternoon, a letter arrived with an unfamiliar stamp. The handwriting was uneven, as though shaped by trembling fingers. It began with 4 words that made her stop breathing. "I am coming home." The letter was from the American sergeant she had once saved, now an old man himself. He wrote of years spent haunted by the sound of sirens, by the memory of her bowed head, by the feeling of peace he never found again. "If it's not too late," he wrote, "I'd like to thank you once more." Weeks later, a small crowd gathered at her clinic when a car arrived from the port. The soldier stepped out slower now, his uniform replaced by a simple jacket and a cane. When their eyes met, the years between them seemed to vanish like fog in morning light. The moment was silent at first. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Every word had already been said in that ruined hospital decades ago, when she chose mercy over fear. Finally, the man whispered, "You look the same." Aiko laughed softly, the sound warm and trembling. "And you still speak too much," she replied, her English still imperfect, her heart still steady. He handed her a small box wrapped in cloth. Inside was the faded photograph of their first meeting, the one that had traveled the world. "I kept it all these years," he said, "to remind myself that forgiveness has a face." Aiko stared at the picture, her hands trembling around it. She had never truly seen herself through another's eyes until now. For the first time, she understood that her act of kindness had not ended with her. It had echoed through someone else's life like an unending prayer. Around them, cherry blossoms fell quietly, covering the ground like snow. The air smelled of earth and remembrance. The nurse and the soldier stood side by side beneath the same sky that had once burned with fire. "Do you ever think," he asked softly, "that maybe God wanted us to meet for peace, not for war?" She looked up at the drifting petals and nodded. "Maybe mercy is his language," she said, and he smiled as if those words had healed something unseen. They spoke for hours, not about battles or nations, but about small things: gardens, books, the taste of coffee after rain. Time, once an enemy, became their friend. Every sentence was a reconciliation between two lives that had once been divided by fear. Before leaving, the soldier reached out his hand, the same one that had once trembled on a battlefield. Aiko took it without hesitation, her fingers fragile yet firm. The gesture felt both like farewell and renewal. He bowed slightly before stepping away, saying only, "You taught me how to live." She watched him disappear down the path, the cherry blossoms swirling around his feet like blessings. Peace, she realized, had finally come full circle. Because sometimes the greatest reunions aren't about meeting again. They're about recognizing that kindness never really left. Years passed, and Japan rose slowly from its ashes. The war's ghost still lingered in ruins and memories, but people were beginning to plant, build, and believe again. Aiko watched as a new generation grew up knowing peace as their only teacher. Her clinic became more than a place for healing. It became a classroom for kindness. Young nurses came from across the country to learn from her not just medicine, but mercy. She told them that steady hands mean nothing without a steady heart. On her wall hung the same faded photograph, now framed with care. Visitors would pause before it, reading the inscription beneath: "When compassion crossed enemy lines." To Aiko, it was not a trophy. It was a reminder of how fragile goodness could be. Schools began inviting her to speak to students about the war. She never mentioned sides or nations, only choices. "You do not need to win a war to prove strength," she told them. "You need only to hold another's pain and not look away." The children listened in silence, their notebooks untouched. Many had grandparents who still carried bitterness, but Aiko's voice softened something in them. Her story turned history into humanity. In time, newspapers began to call her the healer of nations. The title embarrassed her, but she accepted it with humility. She often said the only thing she healed was herself, by choosing to forgive. One evening, an American delegation visited her clinic. Among them was a woman who introduced herself as the soldier's granddaughter. "He told me to thank you," she said, tears in her eyes, "for teaching him to believe in good again." Aiko smiled gently and led the young woman to the garden behind the clinic. The cherry trees were in full bloom, their petals drifting like snow. "Your grandfather planted the first one," she said softly. "He wanted peace to have roots." The granddaughter touched the tree's trunk with reverence. "He used to tell us," she whispered, "that a war can destroy cities, but kindness rebuilds souls." Aiko's eyes glistened, for those were the words she had once told the sergeant decades ago. News of the meeting spread quietly, appearing in small print beneath headlines about economics and politics. Yet people noticed it. They said it felt like the world had taken a deep breath. In universities, students began to study her life alongside statesmen and generals. Professors called her a quiet revolutionary. Her weapon, they said, was empathy, and it had achieved what armies could not. By the time she reached her 70s, Aiko no longer gave speeches or interviews. She spent her days walking the garden paths, tending the blossoms, listening to the wind. The past no longer haunted her. It had become her teacher. On the anniversary of the war's end, she lit a lantern and placed it in the pond beside the cherry trees. Its reflection shimmered like a second moon. "For those we lost," she whispered, "and for those we learned to love." Because in the end, peace had not been written in treaties or flags. It had bloomed quietly in the hands of a nurse who chose to care when the world had forgotten how. Decades after her passing, Japan stood tall among nations once again. Skyscrapers replaced the rubble, neon signs replaced the smoke. But beneath the noise of progress, Aiko's story quietly endured. Teachers still spoke of her in classrooms, not as legend, but as proof that peace was built by ordinary people. In America, the same photograph hung in the Smithsonian's War and Humanity exhibit. Visitors paused before it, whispering, "She hugged him," in disbelief. Parents used it to teach their children that kindness was not weakness. It was courage in its purest form. Every year on the anniversary of VJ Day, flowers arrived anonymously at the museum. No note, no name, just a single white lily and a tag reading, "For the nurse." Curators eventually stopped asking who sent them. Some truths didn't need answers. Across the ocean, in Tokyo, a statue of Aiko stood in a quiet park. She wasn't shown holding a flag or standing tall like a hero. Instead, she was kneeling, arms open, the universal pose of someone ready to comfort. Children would play around the statue, laughing, unaware that they were circling a symbol of reconciliation. Their laughter was her memorial. The sound she had once dreamed would replace sirens. Time, she had once said, was the gentlest healer. In university lectures, historians began to call her the Mother of Mercy. Not because she ended wars, but because she ended excuses for cruelty. Her gesture became the proof that compassion could rewrite history without erasing pain. Veterans who had once fought on opposite sides sometimes met under her statue. They came not to talk about battles, but to sit in silence beside someone who had reminded them what humanity looked like. Many said that the war finally ended the day they forgave. In one ceremony, an elderly American pilot placed his cap at the statue's feet. His hands shook as he said, "I never met her, but she saved us all." The crowd fell silent, realizing that even decades later, the weight of mercy could still bend knees. Schools began exchanging letters between Japanese and American students, inspired by her story. They wrote not about politics or history, but about dreams, gardens, and peace. The children didn't know it, but they were continuing the very conversation Aiko had started with her hug. Filmmakers, artists, and poets drew inspiration from that single moment of connection. They painted her face not as flawless, but as weary and kind, as someone who had seen hell and still chosen hope. Her story became less about war and more about the fragile beauty of forgiveness. In both nations, anniversaries of her life drew small but sincere crowds. Candles glowed beneath cherry blossoms, prayers were whispered in 2 languages, and for a few moments the Pacific Ocean felt smaller. Peace, it turned out, had memory. A Japanese-American choir performed at one such memorial, singing a song titled Hands That Heal. The lyrics echoed her legacy. She held no weapon, yet her heart disarmed the world. Listeners wept, not from sorrow, but from gratitude that kindness could still move them. As decades turned into generations, her story became less about history and more about inheritance. Children grew up believing that empathy was the mark of strength, and perhaps Aiko would have smiled to know that mercy had become tradition. Because though the war had ended long ago, her embrace still lived. In photographs, in gardens, and in the quiet way people now reach for one another instead of turning away.